Tragedy breaks the human soul. Horror is what crawls into the cracks. Welcome to Wicked Files. The earth remembers what the shovel tries to hide, and the dead have a terrible way of making us dig it back up. The jagged, wind-battered coastline of northern Oregon is a place where the sun always seems to be dying. The sky is a permanent, bruised shade of violet and gray, and the dense pine forests look like jagged black teeth, ready to swallow the winding coastal highways. My husband, Caleb, was gripping the steering wheel of our sedan, his face illuminated by the weak dashboard lights. We had been driving for 6 hours, navigating the treacherous switchbacks to reach his uncle's isolated, cliffside estate. We had been married for exactly 5 days. This was supposed to be the final, relaxing leg of our honeymoon, but as we drove deeper into the suffocating fog rolling off the Pacific Ocean, an overwhelming, crushing weight settled directly onto my chest. "Almost there, Val?" Caleb smiled, reaching over to squeeze my freezing hand. "I know it's in the middle of nowhere, but wait until you see the house. Uncle Harrison built it himself. He's been practically vibrating with excitement all week." Caleb chuckled softly. "Aunt Margaret called me last night. She said the power blew out in the storm, and Harrison was just pacing the dark hallways for hours, obsessing over our arrival. He can't wait to see us." I tried to force a smile, but my stomach was violently churning. "It's very isolated out here." "That's the charm," Caleb replied. 20 minutes later, the rusted iron gates of the estate loomed in the headlights. The house was a sprawling, Gothic-style Victorian monstrosity built from dark, weathered timber and gray stone. It sat dangerously close to the edge of the cliff, overlooking the churning, black ocean below. As we pulled into the gravel driveway, the heavy oak front door swung open. Aunt Margaret stood on the porch, wrapped in a thick wool shawl. She was a warm, soft-featured woman who immediately rushed down the wooden steps to embrace Caleb. Behind her, hovering in the doorway like a nervous shadow, was Uncle Harrison. "Oh, Caleb, look at you," Margaret beamed, holding his face in her hands before turning her bright eyes to me. "And Valerie, oh my goodness, you are even more stunning than the photographs. How did a scoundrel like my nephew convince you to marry him?" "I ask myself that every morning, Aunt Margaret." I laughed politely, stepping onto the porch. I extended my hand to Uncle Harrison. He took it, but his grip was weak, trembling slightly. Despite the freezing, biting wind coming off the ocean, Harrison's forehead was glistening with a thick layer of cold sweat. His eyes were entirely bloodshot, darting around the foggy driveway as if he expected something to crawl out of the tree line. "Glad you made it," Harrison muttered, his voice hoarse and distracted. "The roads are dangerous. Lots of accidents happen in the dark." Margaret playfully swatted her husband's arm. "Stop being so morbid, Harrison. Come inside, both of you. It's freezing. I have a massive pot of hot coastal stew on the stove." We stepped into the grand foyer. The interior of the house was heavily shadowed, illuminated only by a few dim, flickering tungsten bulbs. The air smelled intensely of sea salt, rotting driftwood, and a faint, sickening undertone of damp earth. "Harrison has a million embarrassing stories about your childhood." "Caleb," Margaret laughed, taking our wet coats. "He's been threatening to tell Valerie all about the time you accidentally set the neighbor's shed on fire. But before he talks your ear off, why don't you two head upstairs to the guest suite? Freshen up, unpack your bags, and come down when you're ready to eat." Caleb grabbed our heavy suitcases and led me up the sprawling mahogany staircase. The guest room was massive, dominated by a heavy, four-poster bed and heavy velvet drapes that completely blocked out the coastal storm outside. Caleb dropped the bags, walked over to me, and gently wrapped his arms around my waist, pulling me close. "You look beautiful," Caleb whispered, kissing the side of my neck. I smiled, my heart fluttering despite the heavy dread of the house. I gently pushed his chest. "Caleb, stop. Go lock the door. Aunt Margaret could walk in at any second." "You're my wife now, Valerie?" Caleb grinned, his eyes full of absolute adoration. "I have every right to hold you. Besides, I'm only going to let you go for 10 minutes. I'm going to run downstairs, grab us some hot tea from the kitchen, and say hi to Harrison. Then I'm coming right back up here, and tonight, nobody is pulling us apart." He kissed me deeply and slipped out of the room, leaving the heavy oak door slightly ajar. I let out a long breath, trying to shake the profound, irrational terror that had gripped my spine since we arrived. I walked into the adjoining ensuite bathroom to wash the travel grime off my face. The bathroom was entirely tiled in cold, white marble. A massive, antique mirror hung over the porcelain sink. I turned the brass faucets. The water sputtered violently, spitting out a thick, rusty brown sludge before finally running clear. I splashed the freezing water onto my face, shivering as the icy temperature shocked my skin. Then the music started. It was faint at first, echoing through the rusted metal ventilation grates near the ceiling. It sounded like an old, warped gramophone record playing a slow, melancholic classical waltz. The music was scratchy, heavily distorted, and completely out of place in the silent, brooding house. I grabbed a hand towel and slowly patted my face dry, my heart suddenly hammering a frantic, erratic rhythm against my ribs. The ambient temperature in the bathroom plummeted so fast that my breath plumed into thick white smoke. The steam from the hot water pipes had completely fogged up the antique mirror. I reached out with a trembling hand and wiped a wide circle through the condensation on the glass. I looked at my reflection, and then my heart entirely stopped. Standing directly behind me in the mirror, inches from my shoulder, was a woman. She was completely soaked. Her long, black hair was plastered to her pale, rotting face in heavy, wet clumps. Her skin was a bloated, sickly shade of gray, peeling away from her cheekbones like wet paper. She was wearing a shredded, mud-stained dress, but it was her eyes that shattered my sanity. They were entirely devoid of life, milky white, weeping thick, dark tears of swamp mud. Her jaw unhinged with a sickening, wet crack, and she let out a guttural, gurgling gasp. "Help me!" I spun around, a blood-curdling primal shriek tearing its way out of my lungs. There was no one there. The bathroom was completely empty. I lunged for the door, grabbing the brass handle, but it was completely jammed. I violently twisted it, rattling the heavy wood, screaming for my husband. "Caleb! Caleb! Help me! Open the door!" Suddenly, the heavy oak door violently splintered inward. Caleb kicked the door completely off its hinges, bursting into the bathroom with absolute, blind panic in his eyes. I collapsed against his chest, weeping hysterically, pointing a violently shaking finger at the antique mirror. She was right there, I sobbed, my entire body convulsing with terror. In the glass, Caleb, there was a dead woman standing right behind me. She was rotting. "Get me out of here. Please, Caleb, I want to leave right now." Caleb held me tightly, scanning the empty bathroom, his face pale with concern. But there was no fear in his eyes, only profound, heartbroken pity. "Valerie, sweetheart, look at me," Caleb murmured, stroking my hair, desperately trying to calm my hyperventilating lungs. There is nobody here. I was right downstairs. I came the second I heard you scream. You're exhausted. We drove for 6 hours through a storm. The shadows in this old house are just playing tricks on your tired eyes. I am not crazy, Caleb, I pleaded, digging my fingernails into his shirt. I saw her face. I know you think you did, Val, but you are just completely drained. Let's get you into bed. I promise you are perfectly safe here. He carried me out of the freezing bathroom and laid me on the massive 4-poster bed, pulling the heavy quilts up to my chin. He meant well. He loved me, but he didn't understand the absolute, suffocating reality of what was happening to me. As I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, I realized the terrifying truth. The exhaustion I was feeling wasn't from the long drive. It was the house. Since the exact moment I stepped through the front doors of the estate, I felt a heavy, parasitic suction pulling at my soul. The air in the house was heavy with an invisible, malignant gravity. It felt as though a supernatural vacuum was actively, aggressively draining the vital energy out of my blood, leaving me physically hollow and spiritually defenseless. Around 3 a.m., the oppressive silence of the estate was broken by the sound of heavy, dragging footsteps echoing from the basement beneath our room. I slipped out of bed, leaving Caleb sleeping soundly. I crept down the grand mahogany staircase, following the faint, flickering glow of a flashlight coming from the open cellar door in the kitchen. I held my breath and peered down the wooden steps into the pitch-black storeroom. Uncle Harrison was on his hands and knees in the dirt floor of the cellar, aggressively digging through heavy cardboard boxes, panting heavily, his clothes covered in thick cobwebs and dust. Suddenly, Aunt Margaret appeared at the bottom of the stairs, holding a lantern. "Harrison, what in God's name are you doing down here in the pitch black?" Margaret demanded, her voice sharp and irritated. "You're completely drenched in sweat." Harrison jumped, dropping his flashlight, looking like a cornered, terrified animal. I was looking for Caleb's old photo albums, the ones from his childhood. I wanted to show them to Valerie in the morning. Margaret stared at him, her expression a mix of anger and deep concern. "You are losing your mind, Harrison. You know perfectly well I moved all the family albums to the glass cabinet in the upstairs parlor 3 years ago. What are you actually looking for?" Harrison didn't answer. He just stared at the dirt floor of the cellar, his eyes wide with a blinding, unspeakable terror, as if the ground beneath his feet was suddenly going to open up and swallow him whole. I crept back up the grand mahogany staircase, my bare feet completely silent against the heavy wooden floorboards. My mind was violently racing, trying to process the sheer, unadulterated terror radiating from Uncle Harrison in that pitch-black cellar. This house was not a sanctuary. It was a suffocating, rotting trap, and the people inside it were hiding something horrific. When I slipped back under the heavy quilts of the 4-poster bed, Caleb was awake. He was sitting up in the dark, rubbing his eyes. "Valerie, where did you go?" he asked softly, reaching out to touch my freezing arm. "I just went to get a glass of water," I lied, my voice trembling. I didn't want to tell him about Harrison. I didn't want him to think I was losing my mind, not after the hysterical breakdown in the bathroom. Caleb pulled me against his chest, wrapping his strong arms completely around my shivering body. "I'm sorry, Val," he whispered into my hair. "I'm so sorry I dismissed you in the bathroom. I know you're terrified. I know this house is oppressive. I promise you, I believe that you are scared, and I will protect you. We'll leave early tomorrow if you want. We don't have to stay here." His words should have brought me comfort, But before I could even open my mouth to thank him, the temperature in the bedroom violently plummeted. The heavy, suffocating stench of rotting driftwood and stagnant swamp water flooded the room. And then, directly beside my left ear, hovering inches from my face in the absolute pitch-black darkness, a voice spoke. It was a wet, gurgling, feminine whisper, vibrating with a profound, agonizing sorrow. "He put me in the dark. Don't let him keep me in the dark." I shrieked, violently thrashing backward against the headboard. I scrambled across the mattress, slapping my hand desperately against the bedside table until I found the brass lamp switch. Click. The dim tungsten bulb flooded the room with weak, yellow light. "Valerie, what is it?" Caleb shouted, jumping out of bed, his fists clenched as he scanned the empty corners of the room. "She's in here," I sobbed, frantically scrambling to turn on the overhead chandelier, the vanity mirror lights, and the small reading lamp in the corner. I wanted every single shadow eradicated. I heard her. She was right next to my face. "Do not turn off the lights. Caleb, do not let it go dark." I sat in the center of the bed, pulling my knees to my chest, completely paralyzed by the crushing, parasitic dread draining the energy directly from my bones. Caleb sat beside me for hours, holding my hand under the glaring, artificial light, completely helpless against the invisible rot that was suffocating his bride. Sometime around 2 a.m., my physical exhaustion finally forced my eyes shut, but my mind refused to sleep. I drifted in a terrifying, liminal space between consciousness and nightmares. A faint, rhythmic creaking sound outside our bedroom door violently snapped me awake. The lights in our room were still blazing, but beneath the crack of the heavy oak door, the hallway was entirely pitch black. I could hear the floorboards groaning under the weight of someone standing directly outside our room. I nudged Caleb, but he was completely dead to the world, snoring softly. I slowly slipped out of bed, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. I crept toward the door and pressed my ear against the cold wood. I could hear heavy, ragged breathing on the other side. Someone was standing right there, listening to us sleep. Suddenly, a sharp, angry whisper pierced the silence of the hallway. "Harrison, what in God's name are you doing?" It was Aunt Margaret. I held my breath, pressing my eye to the antique brass keyhole. Uncle Harrison was standing inches from our door. In the pale moonlight filtering through the hallway window, he looked absolutely ghastly. He was sweating profusely, his thin hair plastered to his forehead. His eyes were wide, completely fixated on the wood of our door. I was just checking on them," Harrison stammered, his voice trembling violently. "Valerie looked so disturbed earlier. I thought I heard a noise. I just wanted to make sure they were safe." "You do not creep outside a newlywed couple's bedroom in the middle of the night," Margaret hissed, grabbing his arm and yanking him backward. "Look at you. You are completely drenched in sweat. You look like a madman. You don't understand." "Margaret," Harrison wheezed, his eyes darting frantically toward the dark corners of the corridor. "She's awake. The house is awake." The absolute second those words left his mouth, the electrical wiring in the ceiling violently short-circuited. The glass bulbs in the hallway wall sconces loudly popped, showering the carpet in sparks. The shadows violently stretched across the walls, and the ambient temperature dropped so fast I could feel the frost seeping beneath the doorframe. Harrison let out a terrified, strangled gasp, and Margaret quickly dragged him down the hall, their hurried footsteps echoing into the dark. I backed away from the door, sliding down the wall until I hit the floorboards, completely consumed by an overwhelming, supernatural dread. The next morning, the Oregon coast was battered by a severe, torrential thunderstorm. The sky was the color of bruised iron, and the relentless rain hammered against the glass panes of the estate like a barrage of heavy stones. When I finally forced myself out of bed, I felt physically hollowed out. My skin was pale, and my limbs felt like they were filled with heavy, wet sand. The parasitic entity haunting the estate had spent the entire night actively feeding on my spiritual energy. I left Caleb sleeping and walked downstairs. The house was suffocatingly quiet. As I wandered through the grand foyer, I felt a strange, magnetic pull. It wasn't a conscious thought. It was a physical, almost hypnotic compulsion drawing me toward the heavy glass patio doors at the back of the house. I pushed the doors open, stepping out onto the covered wooden veranda. The freezing coastal wind whipped my hair across my face, but I didn't care. I was staring directly at the massive, overgrown garden near the edge of the jagged cliff. In the center of the garden, completely exposed to the torrential rain, was a massive square of freshly overturned, pitch-black earth. I felt my feet moving on their own. I stepped off the wooden porch and walked directly into the freezing, heavy downpour. The rain instantly soaked my clothes, but the hypnotic, terrifying pull of that black mud was absolute. I walked toward the excavation site, my eyes locked on the churning, flooded earth. I heard the voice again. It wasn't in my ear this time. It was coming directly from beneath the soil, a wet, suffocating gurgle pleading for someone to dig. Valerie! A violent, bruising grip suddenly clamped down on my bicep. I gasped, violently yanked backward out of my trance. Uncle Harrison was standing in the pouring rain, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "What are you doing out here?" Harrison roared over the sound of the storm, his fingers digging so deeply into my arm that I cried out in pain. "I was just looking," I pleaded, terrified by the sheer violence in his eyes. "I just came out to the garden. You stay away from this dirt," Harrison screamed, physically shoving me backward toward the house. "You have no business out here. The gardener takes care of this. Stay away from the tank." I tried to back away from him, but the parasitic drain on my body suddenly reached a catastrophic climax. The overwhelming stench of rotting mud flooded my lungs. The black earth beneath my feet felt like it was physically vibrating. My vision completely blacked out. My knees buckled, and I collapsed face first into the freezing mud, spiraling into absolute darkness. I woke up on the velvet sofa in the upstairs parlor. Someone had changed me into dry clothes. Caleb was kneeling beside me, holding my hands, his face pale with worry. Aunt Margaret was standing by the fireplace, wringing her hands nervously. "Thank God," Caleb exhaled, kissing my forehead as my eyes fluttered open. "You fainted in the rain, Val. Harrison had to carry you inside. Your blood pressure completely dropped." I weakly turned my head. Uncle Harrison wasn't looking at me. He was standing by the massive bay windows at the far end of the parlor, staring blankly out at the torrential storm. He was completely unresponsive, completely entirely spaced out. Margaret sighed, a deep, exhausted sound, and walked over to Caleb. "He hasn't been the same for a long time, Caleb," she whispered, keeping an eye on her husband. "Ever since he started excavating that massive underground water cistern in the garden 2 years ago, his mind has been completely deteriorating. He just stares at the dirt for hours." Suddenly, Harrison violently slammed his hands against the window glass. "She's right there," Harrison shrieked, his voice cracking with absolute, paralyzing terror. Caleb jumped up and rushed to the window, peering through the heavy rain. "Uncle Harrison, there is nothing out there. It's just the storm. Look at her," Harrison roared, his eyes wide and bloodshot, pointing a shaking finger directly at the flooded excavation site. To Caleb and Margaret, it was just an empty garden. But through the psychic tether draining my life force, I could see exactly what the murderer was seeing. Standing dead in the center of the torrential downpour, completely coated in thick, black, rotting sludge, was the woman from the bathroom mirror, Cordelia. Her milky white eyes were locked entirely on Uncle Harrison. She slowly raised a decaying, mud-stained finger and pointed it directly at his chest, promising absolute, inescapable vengeance. The heavy brass knocker on the front door suddenly slammed 3 times. Margaret rushed down the stairs to open it. Standing on the porch, completely soaked, was Reverend Callahan, the head of the local coastal parish. Margaret had called him to bless our marriage upon our arrival, completely unaware that she was inviting a spiritual predator into a house built on secrets. Reverend Callahan stepped into the foyer and immediately froze. He didn't take off his coat. He didn't offer a polite greeting. He dropped his heavy black umbrella onto the hardwood floor, his weathered face draining of all color. "Margaret," Reverend Callahan whispered, his voice vibrating with absolute, undeniable dread. "What has happened in this house?" "Whatever do you mean, Reverend?" Margaret asked nervously. "We just had a bit of a scare with my niece fainting in the rain." "This is not sickness," Callahan said firmly, stepping back toward the door as if the floorboards were made of acid. "The air in this house is completely saturated in blood. There is a horrific, violent entity anchored to this property. A terrible, tragic slaughter occurred here." "That is impossible," Margaret argued, highly offended. "Harrison and I only bought this land 2 years ago. We built the extension and the cistern ourselves. Nobody died here." Reverend Callahan refused to cross the threshold any further. He looked directly up the staircase, his eyes locking onto mine as Caleb helped me down the steps. "The girl is being consumed," Callahan stated, his voice booming with authority. "The shadow is using her spiritual energy as a battery to manifest its revenge. You must all leave this property right now. I will not eat or drink in a slaughterhouse. Bring her to the church immediately for a protective blessing, before the entity completely drains her soul." As Margaret desperately tried to argue with the priest, I looked up at the second-floor landing. Uncle Harrison was standing in the shadows, listening to the Reverend's terrifying diagnosis. He was completely hyperventilating, aggressively pulling at his own hair. "Cordelia," Harrison whispered into the dark, his voice completely broken by his own monstrous guilt. "She's digging her way out. She's going to tell them everything." Reverend Callahan did not wait for Aunt Margaret to offer another excuse. He turned his back on the estate, opened his heavy black umbrella, and walked directly out into the freezing, torrential Oregon storm. He left us completely trapped in a house that he had just unequivocally declared a slaughterhouse. The heavy oak front door clicked shut, sealing us inside. The silence that followed was suffocating, heavy with the weight of unburied secrets. "I am packing our bags," Caleb said, his voice hard, completely stripped of his usual gentle demeanor. He didn't look at his uncle or aunt. He looked directly at me. "We are leaving this property tonight, Valerie. Storm or no storm. I am going out to the car to grab the emergency road flares and the map from the trunk. Wait right here. Caleb, don't go outside," I pleaded, the parasitic dread clawing violently at my chest. I will be right back. I promise, he swore, pulling his heavy waterproof jacket over his shoulders and stepping out into the blinding, freezing rain. I stood in the grand foyer, wrapping my arms tightly around my shivering torso. I walked slowly toward the heavy glass patio doors at the back of the house, peering through the condensation into the gloom of the coastal evening. Through the sheet of heavy rain, I could barely make out Caleb's silhouette near the driveway, but he wasn't alone. Standing a few feet away from him, completely exposed to the torrential downpour, was a woman. It was Cordelia. She wasn't fully obscured by the shadows anymore. She was wearing the same shredded, mud-stained dress, her long black hair plastered to her gray, bloated face. I could see her through the glass, but the psychic tether connecting me to her rotting spirit allowed me to hear exactly what was happening in the driveway, as if I were standing right next to them. Cordelia was weeping. It was a harrowing, gurgling sound, like lungs slowly filling with swamp water. "Help me?" Cordelia gasped, stepping toward Caleb, her milky white eyes wide with a terrifying, agonizing desperation. Caleb froze, dropping his car keys onto the wet gravel. He was finally seeing the horrific truth I had been screaming about. The color completely drained from his face as the supernatural temperature plummeted around him. Who are you?" Caleb stammered, backing up against the hood of the sedan. "No one will help me," Cordelia wept, raising a trembling, decaying hand to point directly at the massive, dark silhouette of the Victorian estate. "The phone line was cut. He trapped me in the dark. Please, ask him. Ask Harrison who Cordelia is." A massive crack of lightning violently illuminated the sky, and in the blinding flash of white light, the woman simply ceased to exist. She dissolved into the freezing rain, leaving Caleb standing completely alone in the driveway, hyperventilating in sheer terror. Seconds later, the front door violently burst open. Caleb sprinted into the foyer, absolutely drenched, his chest heaving violently. "Uncle Harrison!" Caleb roared, his voice echoing up the grand mahogany staircase with enough force to rattle the crystal chandelier. "Get down here right now." Harrison slowly emerged from the upstairs parlor, his face an absolute mask of pale, sweating panic. Margaret followed closely behind him, clutching the banister, completely bewildered by Caleb's explosive rage. "What has gotten into you, Caleb?" Margaret demanded. "I saw her," Caleb shouted, pointing a shaking finger toward the front door. "I saw the woman Valerie saw in the bathroom. She was standing right in front of me in the rain. She looked like a rotting corpse, Harrison, and she told me to ask you a question." Harrison gripped the wooden railing so hard his knuckles turned bone white. He looked like he was about to physically vomit. I don't know what you are talking about, boy. You are both hysterical." "Who is Cordelia?" Caleb roared, stepping onto the first stair, closing the distance. The name hit Harrison like a physical bullet. His knees buckled slightly, and he had to lean entirely against the wall to keep from collapsing down the stairs. Margaret frowned, looking at her husband in total confusion. "Cordelia? Harrison, who is Cordelia?" "Nobody," Harrison shrieked, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. He aggressively wiped the freezing sweat from his face. "It's the storm. It's the coastal isolation. It plays tricks on the mind. You and Valerie need to pack your bags and leave right now. This house is making you sick. Get out of my house." Harrison didn't wait for a response. He turned and practically ran down the second-floor corridor, locking himself in his private study. Margaret stood on the landing, completely paralyzed, staring at the empty space where her husband had just been. I don't understand," she whispered, her voice trembling. Caleb grabbed my hand, his grip tight and completely resolute. "We are leaving. We are packing the bags and we are driving until we hit Portland. I am not spending another second in this slaughterhouse." We rushed upstairs to the guest suite and violently shoved our clothes into the suitcases. My head was pounding, the psychic drain on my body reaching an agonizing crescendo. The entity wasn't just feeding on me anymore. It was using my spiritual energy to forcibly rip the truth out of the earth. As Caleb zipped up the last bag, I walked over to the heavy velvet drapes and pulled them back to look out the window. Down in the torrential, pitch-black storm, a solitary beam of light was moving aggressively across the overgrown garden. It was Uncle Harrison. He was wearing a heavy yellow rain slicker, carrying a massive, heavy red metal gasoline jerrycan in one hand and a flashlight in the other. He was marching directly toward the flooded excavation site of the underground cistern. "Caleb?" I gasped, my blood instantly turning to ice. "Look!" Caleb rushed to the window. "He's going to the water tank. What the hell is he doing with a gas can?" "He's destroying the evidence," I whispered, the horrific realization crashing over me. "Whatever he buried down there, whoever Cordelia is, he's going to burn it." "No," Caleb snarled, dropping the suitcase. "I am not letting a murderer cover his tracks while my wife is tortured by the victim." We sprinted out of the room, down the stairs, and burst through the patio doors, running blindly into the freezing, violent coastal storm. We reached the edge of the deep, excavated pit just as Harrison was unscrewing the cap of the red gasoline can. The massive hole in the earth was rapidly filling with rainwater and thick, churning black mud. "Harrison, drop the can," Caleb shouted over the roaring wind. Harrison spun around, his eyes wide, feral, and completely unhinged. "Stay back, both of you. You don't understand. She won't leave me alone. I have to burn the rot out of the ground. I have to burn her again." He tipped the heavy metal can, pouring gallons of raw gasoline directly into the flooded, muddy pit. The suffocating, chemical stench of fuel mixed violently with the smell of rotting swamp water. Harrison fumbled frantically in his pockets, pulling out a silver lighter, his hands shaking so violently he could barely spark the flint. As I stared down into the gasoline-soaked mud, the parasitic tether anchored to my soul suddenly snapped taut. My vision violently flashed. The storm, Caleb, and the modern world instantly vanished. I was violently pulled backward in time, thrust into a terrifying, psychic flashback of the very tragedy that had cursed this soil. I am standing in this exact garden, but the cistern is only half dug. The sun is setting. Uncle Harrison is standing by the edge of the pit, holding a heavy iron shovel. Standing across from him is Cordelia. She is beautiful, full of life, but she is weeping with absolute, heartbroken fury. "How long, Harrison?" Cordelia screams, her voice cracking. "How long am I supposed to be your dirty little secret? I have spent 3 years hiding in motel rooms and coastal cabins. You promised me you would leave Margaret. You promised me I would be your wife. Keep your voice down," Harrison hisses, his face twisting with a deeply arrogant, ugly panic. "I provide for you. I pay for your silence. You are nothing but a temporary distraction. Cordelia, I will never divorce my wife and ruin my social standing for a cheap mistress. I am pregnant," Cordelia roars, stepping toward him, her hands balled into fists. "I am not taking your hush money anymore. I am going into that house right now, and I am going to tell Margaret everything. She turns toward the patio doors, but Harrison's arrogance shatters into a blinding, murderous rage. He raises the heavy iron shovel high above his head and brings the flat metal blade down violently against the back of Cordelia's skull. A sickening, wet crack echoes through the garden. Cordelia collapses into the mud, instantly paralyzed, bleeding heavily from her head. She is alive, but she cannot move. She looks up at him with wide, terrified eyes, begging for her life. Harrison doesn't hesitate. He kicks her violently over the edge, sending her tumbling down into the deep, dark, unfinished water cistern. He grabs the shovel and begins furiously throwing heavy, wet dirt over her body, burying her alive in the suffocating dark to protect his pristine reputation. My consciousness violently snapped back to reality. I collapsed to my knees in the rain, gasping for air, weeping hysterically at the absolute, profound horror I had just witnessed. He buried her alive, I screamed, pointing at Harrison. She was his mistress. She was pregnant. He bludgeoned her and threw her in the dirt. Harrison froze, the silver lighter clicking uselessly in his trembling hand. Shut up, you lying bitch. You don't know anything. He finally managed to spark the flame. He raised the lighter, preparing to throw it into the gasoline-soaked mud. But the earth had completely lost its patience. Before Harrison could drop the lighter, the churning black mud in the center of the pit violently erupted. A massive geyser of freezing, putrid swamp water shot into the air. The heavy scent of raw gasoline was instantly overpowered by the overwhelming, suffocating stench of death. From the very center of the flooded pit, Cordelia rose. She was no longer a weeping, helpless victim. She manifested in her full, terrifying, demonic strength. Her jaw was unhinged, her rotting arms elongated into massive, jagged claws. Harrison, Cordelia roared, her voice an overlapping, aquatic screech that physically shook the ground beneath our feet. Harrison screamed, a pathetic, high-pitched wail of pure cowardice. He turned to run, but Cordelia was impossibly fast. She lunged out of the pit, her rotting hands violently clamping down on Harrison's ankles. She ripped him backward, dragging him face first through the sharp gravel and freezing mud. "Help me! Caleb, please!" Harrison shrieked, desperately clawing at the dirt as the ghost dragged him toward the edge of the pit. Cordelia loomed over him, her milky white eyes glowing with absolute, unadulterated hatred. "You already killed me once, Harrison," she hissed, mocking him as the rain washed the gasoline off her rotting skin. "You cannot burn what is already dead." Suddenly, Aunt Margaret burst out of the patio doors, running into the garden. She stopped dead in her tracks, her umbrella falling from her hands as she witnessed the supernatural horror unfolding on her lawn. "Harrison!" Margaret screamed, staring at the rotting corpse holding her husband pinned to the earth. Cordelia slowly turned her head to look at Margaret. She didn't attack her. Instead, the entity used her supernatural strength to violently force Harrison up onto his knees, digging her jagged claws deep into his shoulders. "Tell her," Cordelia commanded, her aquatic voice echoing in the storm. "Tell your wife what you buried in the dark to protect your pride. Confess, or I will drag your soul into the mud right now." Harrison was weeping uncontrollably, completely broken by the sheer, undeniable reality of his own sins. He looked at Margaret, his face covered in mud and tears. "I'm sorry," Harrison sobbed. "I had an affair, Margaret. Her name was Cordelia. She was going to tell you. She was pregnant." Panicked, I hit her with the shovel and I buried her in the cistern. I just wanted to protect our life. I'm so sorry. Margaret stood in the freezing rain, completely paralyzed. The love, the respect, the entire life she had built with this man shattered into a million irreparable pieces in a single second. She looked at Harrison not with fear, but with absolute, profound, and utterly sickening disgust. "You are a monster," Margaret whispered, turning her back on him and walking slowly back into the house, leaving him completely to the mercy of the dead. With the truth finally unearthed and the murderer exposed to the light, the supernatural gravity in the air violently shifted. Cordelia looked at me. The absolute, blinding rage in her milky eyes softened for a fraction of a second. She hadn't targeted me to kill me. She had used my sensitive spiritual energy as a battery, drawing the strength she needed to manifest and drag the truth out of the earth. With a final, mournful sigh, the entity completely dissolved into a thick mist, washing away into the torrential rain. The crushing, parasitic weight on my chest instantly vanished. My lungs expanded, pulling in clean, natural air for the first time since I arrived at the estate. The curse was broken. The police arrived 3 hours later. They found Uncle Harrison sitting in the mud by the edge of the pit, completely catatonic, whispering apologies to the empty air. The excavation crew drained the cistern the next morning and pulled up the shattered, skeletal remains of Cordelia, confirming every horrific word of his confession. Harrison was sentenced to life in the maximum security state penitentiary. But concrete walls and iron bars are not enough to stop the rot of the past. Sometimes, late at night, the prison guards report hearing a woman weeping in Harrison's cell. They find him cowering in the corner, freezing cold, begging an empty room for forgiveness. The earth always remembers what you bury, and if you try to hide your sins in the dark, the dead will make absolutely certain that you never sleep in the light again.